Let your shoulders fall from your ears, and let your breath find its own slow rhythm. There is nothing required of you now except to rest and listen, while we walk backward through centuries toward a city that no longer stands as it once did. Tonight, we follow a road that stretched from the eastern edge of Asia to the shores of Italy. Chang'an stood as the eastern terminus of the Silk Road under the Han Dynasty, a capital where roads gathered like threads pulled toward a needle's eye. Merchants, monks, and envoys departed from its gates, knowing the road ahead led toward lands most of them would never see. The city's market smelled of hemp rope, lacquer, and horse sweat long before dawn broke over its watchtowers. Chang'an's city walls enclosed one of the largest urban populations in the ancient world. Rammed earth ramparts rose taller than two men standing on each other's shoulders, wrapping around wide avenues laid out in careful grids. Inside, hundreds of thousands of residents lived among government offices, temples, and walled residential wards that closed their gates each night. Bells rang from watch drums to mark the hours, a sound carried on still evening air across tiled roofs. Travelers arriving from the west often remarked on the sheer scale of the place before they had even reached its inner gates. The Han Dynasty's Emperor Wu dispatched Zhang Qian westward in the year 138 before the Common Era. His mission was to seek alliance with distant peoples against nomadic threats on China's northern frontier. Zhang Qian left with a modest escort, carrying little more than official credentials and a general sense of direction toward lands barely known to the Han court. He was captured and held for years before finally continuing his journey. What he brought back reshaped how the empire understood the world beyond its borders. Zhang Qian's mission opened the first official diplomatic contact with Central Asia. He returned describing kingdoms unknown to Chinese records, fertile valleys, strange fruits, and horses larger and swifter than any bred in China. His written reports, later preserved by the historian Sima Qian, described trade goods and customs of peoples living far beyond the Han frontier. The journey took over a decade, most of it spent as a captive rather than a traveler. Still, the roads he mapped in memory became the first threads of what later generations would call the Silk Road. Chinese silk production was a closely guarded imperial secret. For centuries, knowledge of silkworm cultivation and thread spinning remained largely confined within China's borders, protected under threat of severe punishment for anyone attempting to smuggle silkworm eggs abroad. Foreign kingdoms marveled at the fabric's shimmer and lightness without understanding how it was made. Legends grew in distant lands to explain silk's origin, some imagining it grew on trees or was combed from strange plants. The truth, small white worms feeding on mulberry leaves, stayed hidden inside guarded courtyards for generations. Silk was woven in Chang'an's imperial workshops before caravans carried it west. Rows of looms clattered inside long halls staffed by skilled weavers, many of them women working under strict quotas set by court officials. Bolts of finished silk were inspected, folded, and sealed with markings noting quality and origin before ever leaving the capital. The finest patterns were reserved for the imperial household and diplomatic gifts, while plainer weaves eventually found their way into trade bundles. The sound of shuttles moving through warp threads filled these halls from early morning until the light faded. Chinese caravans loaded soap bales onto camels departing from Chang'an's western gate. Handlers checked ropes and balance before dawn, arranging bundles wrapped in coarse cloth against the animals' flanks. Merchants gathered documents, provisions, and small amounts of silver for tolls they expected to pay along the way. The western gate itself was a place of constant motion, dust rising from hooves and cartwheels even before sunrise fully broke. Beyond that gate lay a road that would not return most travelers home for a very long time. The Han government built a network of watchtowers along the route for security. Earthen and timber structures rose at regular intervals across the frontier, manned by small garrisons who watched for raiders and signaled with smoke or fire when danger appeared. Supplies were rotated to these outposts by mule train, since little grew naturally in the surrounding dry country. Soldiers stationed there often served for years, writing letters home on wooden slips that occasionally survive in dry desert soil today. The towers marked, quite literally, where imperial protection thinned toward the edges of the map. Guarded passes controlled traffic, leaving China's western frontier. Officials stationed at these checkpoints recorded names, goods, and destinations in ledgers written on bamboo strips. Travelers without proper permits could be turned back or detained until their business was verified. These passes served both as tax stations and as a last line of imperial oversight before the desert swallowed the road entirely. Beyond them, authority became thinner, negotiated more than enforced, as merchants moved into lands where Han law held little sway. The Hexi Corridor formed the first geographic bottleneck west of Shenzhen. This narrow strip of land ran between forbidding mountains to the south and open desert to the north, funneling nearly all westbound travel through a single manageable passage. Oases fed by mountain snowmelt allowed small settlements to survive along its length, providing water and rest for animals worn down by the journey so far. Without the corridor's scattered springs, the desert crossing beyond would have been nearly impossible for most caravans. It was, in effect, the gate through which the wider world first became reachable from China. Let the breath find its own rhythm now, without any need to shape it. In through the nose, low into the belly, then out again, longer than it came in. Each exhale can carry a little more weight from the shoulders, the jaw, the space behind the eyes. There is no pace to keep and no count to reach, only this one breath, and then the next, unhurried as a lamp burning low through a long night. Wuwei served as a garrison town along the Hexi Corridor. Han soldiers were stationed there to guard granaries, wells, and the narrow road running between them. The town grew around a walled fort, its streets lined with stables for military horses and storehouses for grain shipped in from the east. Merchants passing through often stopped to trade with soldiers who had coin but few goods of their own. Wuwei's importance lay less in wealth than in watchfulness, a fixed point holding the corridor open. Zhangyi stood as a Han military outpost, protecting the corridor. Positioned further west than Wuwei, it guarded a stretch where the mountains pulled close to the desert's edge, narrowing the safe passage even further. Garrison troops maintained irrigation channels fed by snowmelt from the nearby Kilian Range, keeping small fields of grain alive despite the surrounding dryness. Records from the Han bureaucracy list, Zhangyi among the string of walled towns, meant to keep the corridor's western, half under imperial reach. Travelers measured their progress westward, by which fort they had last passed. Jiayuguan marked the western end of the Great Wall. Its fortress gate stood where the wall's defenses finally gave way to open frontier, built later than the Han period, but standing on ground long used to mark that same boundary. Beyond its walls, the land turned harsher, water scarcer, and imperial law thinner. Travelers looking back at Jiayuguan's tower were, in a real sense, looking at the last organized structure of Chinese authority before the desert took over. The pass earned a lasting reputation as the edge of the known and governed world. Merchants paused at Jiayuguan to pay tolls before entering the desert beyond Chinese control. Officials at the gate weighed goods, recorded manifests, and collected fees measured in bolts of cloth, coin, or grain. Some traders lingered for days, waiting on permits, trading gossip with soldiers about conditions further west. Once through the gate, no garrison waited to help if trouble arose, so travelers checked water skins, ropes, and animals with particular care. The toll itself was small compared to what lay ahead, but it marked a clear threshold between protection and the open unknown. Dunhuang sat at the crossroads where northern and southern routes diverged. Travelers arriving from Jiayuguan faced a choice there, deciding whether to skirt the Taklamakan Desert along its northern or southern edge. The oasis town grew wealthy on this decision alone, offering food, lodging, and information to caravans weighing which path might be safer that season. Wells and irrigated fields supported a population far larger than the surrounding desert would suggest possible. Dunhuang's location, more than any single resource, made it indispensable to nearly everyone heading further west. The Mogeo caves near Dunhuang preserved thousands of Buddhist murals, carved into a cliff face over centuries. The caves held painted chambers where monks and pilgrims once knelt in flickering lamplight. Layers of paint from different dynasties still cover many walls, one era's artists working atop another's without erasing what came before. The dry desert air, harsh as it was for travelers, proved gentle to these paintings, preserving colors that would have faded elsewhere. Visitors today still find the same quiet stillness in those carved rooms that pilgrims once sought centuries ago. The library cave at Dunhuang held tens of thousands of ancient manuscripts. Sealed away for reasons no record fully explains, the small chamber remained hidden for roughly 900 years before its rediscovery in the early 1900s. Scrolls inside included Buddhist scripture, but also contracts, letters, medical texts, and calendars written in numerous languages. The sheer variety inside that single sealed room offered scholars an unmatched window into daily life along the route, not just its religion or trade. Many of those manuscripts now rest in museums and libraries, scattered far from the cave that once held them. Buddhist monks carried scriptures through Dunhuang on their way east from India. Traveling on foot or by donkey across mountain passes and desert stretches, these pilgrims sought to bring teachings and texts back toward China's heartland. Dunhuang offered a resting point where monks could copy manuscripts, consult with local scholars, or simply recover from months of difficult travel. Some stayed only briefly, others remained for years, contributing to the growing collection of texts and art housed in the nearby caves. Their footsteps, retraced over generations, helped carry Buddhism steadily eastward along this same desert corridor. The Yumen Pass, or Jade Gate, marked the boundary of Han territory. Its name recalled the jade caravans that once passed through, carrying stone mined far to the west, long before silk became the region's defining trade good. Soldiers stationed near the pass inspected travelers and goods, noting who left the reach of Han law and who returned to it. Beyond the gate, the desert stretched wide and largely ungoverned, home to shifting oases and small kingdoms rather than imperial magistrates. For many travelers, passing through Yumen felt less like crossing a border and more like stepping outside the world they knew. Camel caravans crossed the Gobi Desert between Dunhuang and the Tarim Basin. Bactrian camels carried bales of silk, jars of wine, and sacks of grain across gravel plains where little grew and water came only from a handful of known wells. Guides memorized the positions of dunes and dry riverbeds, passing that knowledge down through generations of desert families. Nights on this stretch turned bitterly cold even after scorching days, forcing caravans to bundle in felt and wool despite the season. Losing the trail here could mean days of wandering before finding another living oasis. Let the weight of the day settle now, beginning at the crown of the head and spreading downward like warm sand filling a hollow. Feel the pillow take the full weight of your skull, no longer holding itself up. Let your shoulders sink, heavier than they were a minute ago, then your arms, then your hands, resting loose and open. Your chest rises and falls on its own, no effort required from you. Let your hips settle into the mattress, then your legs, then your feet, each part giving over its weight until the whole body rests, unmoving, held entirely by what lies beneath it. Two routes skirted the Taklamakan Desert, one north and one south. Caravans chose their path based on season, water sources, and news of which wells still held. The northern road hugged the foothills of the Tian Shan Mountains, drawing on snowmelt streams. The southern road ran along the edge of the Kunlun Range, following a chain of oases fed by underground water. Either way, the desert's dry heart remained untouched by trade routes, too dangerous and waterless for any caravan to attempt crossing directly. The Taklamakan Desert's name is said to mean place of no return. Local tradition and later travelers' accounts gave the desert this grim reputation, tied to tales of caravans that wandered into its shifting dunes and were never seen again. The desert's interior held almost no permanent water, and its sands could bury entire settlements within a lifetime. Wind carved and reshaped the dune field so completely that a path walked one season might vanish by the next. Merchants respected this reputation enough to keep firmly to its edges. The southern route passed through Khotan, famed for its jade. Rivers flowing down from the Kunlun Mountains carried stones polished smooth by centuries of tumbling water, and local gatherers waded into the cold currents to collect them by hand and by foot. Khotan's markets displayed jade in shades of white, green, and mutton fat cream, prized far beyond the oasis itself. Workshops in the town carved raw stone into ornaments, discs, and ritual objects destined for distant courts. The oasis's wealth rested as much on stone from its rivers as on any caravan passing through. Khotan jade was traded eastward to China for centuries before silk trade began. Chinese courts valued jade for ritual and ornamental use long before caravans carried bales of woven cloth westward. Archaeological finds show jade objects from this region reaching Chinese burial sites well before written records of organized silk trade appear. This earlier jade route likely shaped the paths and stopping points that silk caravans would later follow. In this sense, the road itself predates the good that eventually gave it its famous name. The northern route passed through Kucha, a center of Buddhist learning. Monasteries there drew scholars and translators who worked to render Sanskrit texts into the Chinese language, aiding the spread of teachings further east. Kucha's musicians and dancers also gained renown, their styles later influencing court entertainment in Chainshan itself. Caravans stopping in the oasis found not just trade goods but debate halls, libraries, and monks, fluent in several tongues. The town's mixture of commerce and scholarship made it one of the intellectual crossroads of the entire route. Kucha's cave temples at Kizil predate the Mogao caves. Carved into cliffs above a river valley, these chambers hold painted scenes of Buddhist teaching stories, some dating back to the 3rd century of the Common Era. Artists here worked in styles blending Indian, Persian, and local traditions, producing murals distinct from those found further east. Erosion and time have damaged many of these paintings more severely than their counterparts at Dunhuang, leaving faded outlines where full scenes once stood. Even so, enough survives to trace how painting styles moved and changed along the trade route. Turfan's oasis relied on underground Kara's irrigation channels. Dug beneath the desert floor to avoid evaporation under the fierce sun, these tunnels carried snowmelt from distant mountains directly to fields and orchards. Workers maintained the channels by hand, crawling through narrow passages to clear silt and repair collapsed sections. Grapevines and mulberry trees flourished above ground because of water moving unseen beneath it. The system proved so effective that some of these ancient channels remained in use for centuries after their original construction. The ancient city of Lulan was abandoned as the Tarim River shifted course. Once a garrison and trading post, guarding a branch of the southern route, the settlement depended entirely on the river's steady flow for its fields and wells. When the waterway gradually moved away from the city over the centuries, Farmland dried and the population drifted elsewhere in search of reliable water. Sand eventually buried much of what remained, preserving wooden beams, coins, and documents beneath dry drifts. Archaeologists rediscovered the site only in the early 20th century, its walls still standing amid the dunes. Merchants rarely traveled the entire route from one end to the other. Instead, goods passed through a chain of oasis market towns, each trader carrying bales a few stages before selling them onward. A bolt of silk might change hands a dozen times between Shenzhen and the Mediterranean, its price rising with every transaction. This relay system meant few people ever saw both ends of the network they helped connect. Whole fortunes were built on knowing which stretch of the trail to control. Preserved bodies recovered from the Tarim Basin's dry sands reveal features unlike those of neighboring populations. Some mummies, dated to well before the height of Silk Road trade, show light hair and clothing woven in patterns resembling those of distant Western cultures. Researchers studying their remains and garments have pointed to ties with Indo-European-speaking peoples who moved into the region centuries earlier. Wool textiles found beside them echo weaving techniques from far to the west. Their presence hints that exchange across this basin began long before organized caravan trade ever existed. Somewhere beyond the window, a low hum rises and fades, like wind finding a gap in old stone. It swells for a moment, then thins to almost nothing, the way a house settles once everyone inside has stopped moving. Listen to it without trying to name it. Let your shoulders sink a little further into whatever is holding you. The sound will come again, distant and unbothered, and each time it does, you may drift a little closer to sleep. Kashgar stood as the final oasis, where Chinese administration still held firm before the land opened westward into unfamiliar territory. Beyond its gates, garrisons thinned, and imperial authority gave way to a patchwork of local rulers and passing empires. Travelers restocked here before facing the climb into the mountains ahead, trading pack animals suited to desert heat for sturdier breeds built for cold passes. Officials stationed in the town kept records of who passed through and what they carried. For centuries, Kashgar marked the edge of one world and the beginning of another. Kashgar's bazaar drew merchants speaking a dozen tongues into one crowded square. Chinese silk traders haggled beside Persian dealers in dyed wool, while Indian merchants offered spices and gemstones from across the Himalayas. Interpreters moved between stalls, translating prices and terms for buyers who shared no common language. Food stalls served dishes blending flavors from 3 continents, a reflection of who passed through on any given week. The market's noise and color made it one of the most cosmopolitan gathering points anywhere along the route. West of Kashgar rose a mountain range so towering that later travelers called it the roof of the world. Jagged peaks and thin cold air made the Pamirs one of the most demanding stretches on the entire road. Snow lingered late into the warmer months, and sudden storms could trap caravans for days in narrow passes. Pack animals struggled with the altitude, and guides familiar with the terrain became essential rather than optional. Few who crossed these mountains described the experience as anything but grueling. Marco Polo, writing of his own journey centuries later, described the Pamirs as a place where no birds flew and fires burned, strangely due to the thin air. His account, dictated to a scribe after his return to Venice, told of a desolate plateau crossed over many days without settlement or shelter. Historians have debated how literally to read some of his more striking claims, since his book blended first-hand memory with second-hand tales gathered along the way. Still, his description of the crossing's difficulty matches what later explorers of the same terrain reported. The mountains left an impression that outlasted the journey itself. A narrow corridor of valley floor offered the one practical route through this otherwise impassable range. Squeezed between towering peaks on either side, the Wakhan corridor followed a river valley that guided caravans safely between Central Asia and the lands beyond. Its width varied from broad pasture to tight defiles, barely wide enough for animals to pass single file. Herders in the valley grazed livestock on whatever grass the short summer allowed. Without this passage, crossing the Pamirs by any practical means would have been far harder to achieve. In the valleys beyond the mountains, horses bred in the Fergana region gained a reputation reaching all the way to the Han court. Chinese officials described these animals as sweating blood, a phrase possibly referring to a parasite affecting their skin, and prized them for their speed and stamina compared to native breeds. Emperors sought them not just for cavalry, but as symbols of prestige, calling them heavenly horses in official records. Envoys were dispatched specifically to negotiate their purchase or tribute. Owning such horses became a mark of status among the Chinese elite. Desire for these animals grew strong enough to shape military policy. Han armies marched westward on more than one occasion, partly to secure steady access to Fergana's herds, clashing with local rulers unwilling to part with their finest stock. Campaigns stretched supply lines across brutal terrain, costing far more in men and resources than the horses themselves were worth in trade. Yet the value placed on cavalry strength in an empire surrounded by mounted rivals made the effort seem justified to those in command. The pursuit of better horses became, for a time, a matter of state. Samarkand rose from a bend in the Zarafshan River Valley to become one of the great trading hubs of Sogdiana. Walled gardens and mud-brick towers spread across a plateau where irrigation channels fed orchards of apricot and almond. Merchants from Persia, India, and China converged there to exchange goods before the route split further west. Blue-glazed pottery shards found in its ruins hint at workshops that once served travelers from every direction. The city's wealth came less from what it made than from what passed through it. Sogdian families controlled overland trade across Central Asia for centuries, operating far beyond the borders of their own small kingdoms. Their merchants established trading colonies, stretching from the Tarim Basin to the edges of Persia, some settling permanently in foreign cities. Family firms passed roots and contacts down through generations, building networks that outlasted individual rulers. Chinese records describe Sogdian traders as shrewd and tireless, forever moving goods from one oasis market to the next. Their reach exceeded that of any single empire along the route. Sogdian itself became the common tongue spoken between traders who otherwise shared no language. Caravan drivers, innkeepers, and customs officials along vast stretches of the route relied on it to strike deals and settle disputes. Documents written in Sogdian script have surfaced as far east as Chinese watchtowers and as far west as Persian archives. The language carried numbers, weights, and contract terms recognized from one oasis to another. For a long stretch of history, a trader could cross half a continent and still be understood. Let the warmth begin low, somewhere near your feet, spreading upward like sunlight moving across a floor. Feel it settle into your ankles, then rise through your calves, loosening what the day left tight. Let it climb through your knees and thighs, a slow tide of warmth with nowhere urgent to be. Let it reach your chest, your shoulders, your fingertips, until the whole body rests in that same mellow glow. Breathe with it, and let the warmth carry you further down into rest. Bukhara grew as Samarkand's rival, not far to the southwest, its own oasis fed by the Zarafshan's dwindling waters before they vanished into desert sand. Its bazaars specialized in different goods, drawing traders who preferred its routes toward Khwarezm and the lower Oxus Valley. Rivalry between the two cities shaped alliances and trade agreements for generations of Sogdian rulers. Archaeologists have traced Bukhara's oldest layers back through many rebuildings, each city rising on the ruins of the one before it. Both cities profited from roots that neither one fully controlled. A cache of letters written on paper and leather, discovered in a watchtower ruin, preserve the everyday concerns of Sogdian merchants far from home. One writer asked after unpaid debts, another described goods delayed by unrest along the road. These documents, now called the Sogdian Ancient Letters, date to the early centuries of the Common Era and were likely never delivered. Their surviving fragments offer glimpses of ordinary trade correspondence rather than official chronicles. Through them, historians hear the practical voice of commerce rather than the voice of kings. Panjikant's ruins, uncovered layer by layer in the 20th century, preserve wall paintings that once decorated the homes of wealthy Sogdian merchants. Scenes show feasting nobles, musicians, and processions of goods, painted in earthy reds and blues that survived centuries beneath collapsed roofs. Camels and traders appear alongside mythic figures, blending commerce with religion in the same painted room. The city was abandoned after invasions in the 8th century, its plaster walls left to crumble slowly under drifting soil. What remains offers one of the clearest windows into Sogdian daily life. The oasis city of Merv, further southwest along the route, earned a reputation grand enough that later writers called it the Queen of the World. Its markets drew goods from Persia, India, and China alike, gathered beneath walls that had been rebuilt many times over many centuries. Canals fed from the Murgab River sustained fields and gardens that fed a population rivaling many of its era's largest cities. Scholars, poets, and astronomers gathered there when its fortunes rose highest, drawn by patronage as much as by trade. Its ruins today stretch across a wide, weathered plain. Sitting astride the route connecting Central Asia to Persia, Merv served as a natural checkpoint where routes from the northeast and west converged. Its position made it a prize fought over by empire after empire, from Persian dynasties to later Islamic caliphates. Traders passing through paid tolls and exchanged goods before continuing on toward either Samarkand or the Persian heartland. Wells and cisterns scattered across its outskirts supported caravans resting before the harder stretches ahead. Few cities along the entire route occupied so useful a crossing point for so long. Parthian rulers held the middle stretch of the route for centuries, their empire stretching from the edge of Persia to the borders of Roman Syria. Their cavalry, mounted archers trained to fire while retreating, became famous enough to leave its name in later military language. Parthian officials taxed and regulated caravans passing through their territory, profiting handsomely from trade they neither produced nor consumed. Their capital shifted between cities depending on the season, following a court that moved with the climate. For generations, no goods crossed from China to Rome without passing through Parthian hands. Mounted archers under Parthian command perfected a maneuver that later soldiers and historians simply called the Parthian shot. Riders would gallop away from an enemy line, then twist backward in the saddle to loose an arrow at full speed. The technique required years of training and a horse bred for both stamina and nerve. Roman legions encountered it often enough that the tactic entered their own military vocabulary. Long after the empire that invented it faded, its name survived in languages far from Persia. Rome and China rarely dealt with one another directly, and the Parthians preferred it that way. Sitting between the two great powers, Parthian officials profited from every exchange that passed through their hands, and a direct link between the empires would have cut them out entirely. Merchants from either side were steered toward Parthian middlemen, rather than allowed to pass freely onward. Diplomatic missions from both directions found themselves delayed, redirected, or quietly discouraged. The arrangement suited Parthia's treasury far more than it suited the curiosity of Rome or China. Around 97 of the Common Era, a Chinese envoy named Gan Ying set out westward under orders from the general Ban Kao. His journey carried him further than any recorded Chinese official before him, eventually reaching the shores of the Persian Gulf. Records from the Han court describe him standing at the edge of a sea he had never expected to see, further from Chang'an than any envoy on record. Local guides told him what lay beyond that water. His mission, remarkable simply for how far it went, stopped there. According to the Book of the Later Han, sailors warned Gan Ying that the crossing to Rome could take months and might cost sailors their lives to homesickness and despair. Whether the account exaggerated the danger to discourage him or simply reflected real hazards of the voyage, no one recorded. Gan Ying chose to turn back rather than risk the sea route his own government had asked him to attempt. His report on Rome, called Daqin in Chinese sources, relied afterward on second-hand description rather than first-hand sight. The two empires remained, for the rest of their long histories, known to each other only through rumor and trade goods. Think of a single candle flame in a still room, burning low after the household has gone to sleep. Its light no longer flickers with any hurry, it simply glows, small and steady, needing nothing from the dark around it. Wax pools slowly at its base, unnoticed, unmeasured, while the wick shortens without complaint. No one is awake to watch it burn down. It will still be there, dimmer when morning comes, and that is enough for it. Let your own breathing settle into that same unhurried glow, low and steady, asking nothing of the hours ahead. When the Parthian Empire finally gave way, the Sassanid dynasty rose in its place and kept much the same grip on the trade corridor. Persian rulers under this new house continued taxing caravans, garrisoning key towns, and controlling the routes linking east to west. Roman writers noted little change in the difficulty of dealing directly with lands beyond Persia. The corridor's importance outlasted whichever dynasty happened to govern it. Goods kept moving, even as the banners above the fortresses changed. Sassanid weavers, once Chinese methods of silk production, leaked westward through captured workers or careless guards, began producing their own cloth rather than relying solely on imports. Persian silk developed distinct patterns, favoring roundels and animal motifs unlike anything woven in Shangan. Workshops in cities across the empire adapted foreign techniques to local taste and available dyes. The secret China had guarded so carefully no longer stayed a secret at all. Persian silk eventually traveled its own path toward Byzantine and later European markets. Persephone, sprawled along the Tigris River, served the Sassanids as one of their great capitals and a gathering point for trade, moving between Persia and Mesopotamia. Its palaces and markets absorbed goods, arriving from both the overland routes and river traffic below. Roman and Byzantine ambassadors visited its courts more than once over the centuries, describing wealth that impressed even seasoned travelers. The city's massive arched hall, built of unbaked brick, stood for generations after the empire itself had fallen. Little of Ctesiphon's bustle remains visible today beneath the modern landscape that has grown over it. Long before silk caravans ever crossed Persia, the Achaemenid kings had built a royal road stretching from Susa toward the Aegean coast, complete with relay stations for messengers. Later, Silk Road traffic simply adopted stretches of this older infrastructure rather than carving fresh paths through the same difficult terrain. Ridges, way stations, and graded roadbeds built centuries earlier still served merchants moving silk, spices, and glass. Empires changed, but the practical engineering beneath their feet often stayed remarkably useful. Roads built for one purpose quietly outlived the purpose they were built for. Persian caravanserais dotted these roads at intervals, a day's ride apart, offering walled courtyards where merchants and animals could rest safely overnight. Thick outer walls kept out both weather and opportunistic bandits, while a single gate allowed guards to control who entered. Inside, chambers lined the courtyard for sleeping, storage, and stabling, arranged around a central open space. Some caravanserais grew into small permanent settlements, with wells, shops, and even shrines built alongside the resting quarters. Travelers moving through Persia could count on finding one before nightfall on most stretches of the route. Ekbatana rose in the Zagros Mountains, reached by a branch route splitting off from the main Persian highway toward the west. Median kings had built it centuries before the Achaemenids, and it remained a regional capital under later Persian rule. Merchants heading toward Mesopotamia sometimes detoured through its markets, drawn by goods flowing down from the Iranian plateau. Cool mountain air and stone terraces set it apart from the flatter cities along the main corridor. Its layered history left ruins that archaeologists still puzzle over today. Fire temples marked the Persian stretch of the route at regular intervals, each holding a flame tended without interruption by trained priests. Zoroastrian belief held fire sacred, a visible link between the divine and the earthly world travelers passed through. Merchants of many faiths sometimes paused near these shrines, whether from personal devotion or simple respect for local custom. Stone platforms and small chambers housed the flames, protected from wind and rain by thick walls. Some of these sites endured for centuries after the empires that built them had changed hands many times over. Manichaeism, founded by the prophet Mani in the 3rd century, spread outward from Persia along the same roads that carried silk and spice. Its teachings, blending Zoroastrian, Christian, and Buddhist ideas, found audiences among merchants who moved easily between cultures. Missionaries carried Mani's writings eastward, into Central Asian oasis towns, and eventually into China itself. The faith never became dominant anywhere for long, yet fragments of its texts turned up centuries later in the sands near Turfan. Trade routes proved just as useful for carrying belief as they were for carrying bolts of woven cloth. Nestorian Christianity, a branch of the faith centered on teachings from the Church of the East, followed merchant roads eastward through Persia and into Central Asia. By the 7th century, missionaries and traders alike carried its texts as far as the Tang capital, where an imperial edict eventually permitted its practice. A stone monument raised in Change centuries later recorded this arrival in careful, formal script. Small communities of believers settled into oasis towns, scattered across the desert crossings. Their churches, modest and far from home, stood quietly among temples and shrines of older, more established faiths. Goods moved west, and religions moved with them, carried in the same saddlebags, told around the same fires, remembered by the same travelers who repeated them at the next oasis. A merchant might arrive in a foreign market speaking of silk prices, and, in the same conversation, describe a teaching heard 3 towns back. Ideas required no customs post, no toll booth, no special cart. They crossed borders that stopped goods and armies without difficulty. By the time a caravan reached its final stop, it often carried as many beliefs as bales of cloth. Let the muscles around your eyes loosen now, the small ones that hold on without you noticing. Your jaw can drop its grip, just slightly, the way a door settles when no one is pushing against it anymore. Behind your closed lids, there is only a dim, private darkness, warm at the edges, asking nothing of you. Let your eyebrows fall from wherever they've been resting all day. There is a stillness behind your face that has been waiting for you to stop working so hard to hold your own expression. Rivers threading through Mesopotamia gave overland caravans a way to shift their goods onto boats bound for the Persian Gulf. The Tigris and Euphrates carried barges loaded with grain, pottery, and eastern luxuries down toward ports where seagoing vessels waited. Merchants crossing the desert on camel could exchange their animals for river transport, saving weeks of difficult travel. Basra's predecessor settlements grew rich on this shifting point between land and water. Goods bound eventually for Rome sometimes traveled this watery detour before returning to dry roads farther west. Palmyra rose from the Syrian desert as an oasis wealthy enough to rival cities many times its size, its columned streets standing improbably amid dry stone hills. Caravans moving between Persia and the Mediterranean found it a natural stopping point, roughly midway on their westward journey. Local families organized armed escorts to guide merchants safely through the surrounding desert, charging fees that funded the city's growth. Grand temples and a monumental colonnade rose from profits earned guiding strangers through empty country. Little rainfall reached Palmyra, yet its markets overflowed with goods from 3 continents. Palmyrene families built their fortunes not from producing goods, but from taxing the caravans that had no choice but to pass through their territory. Merchants paid tolls at gates and checkpoints scattered along the city's approaches, fees recorded on tariff inscriptions that survive today, carved into stone. The wealth this generated funded temples, tombs, and grand family monuments dotting the desert around the city. Palmyrene traders themselves also ventured abroad, establishing outposts as far as Mesopotamia and the Roman province beyond. A city built on tolls became, for a time, one of the richest in the region. Zenobia, ruling Palmyra after her husband's death, expanded the city's reach far beyond its usual borders, claiming territory stretching from Egypt into parts of Anatolia. For a brief span in the 3rd century, she governed trade routes the Roman Empire had long considered its own. Roman writers described her as capable and ambitious, though the fullest accounts come from historians writing after her defeat. Emperor Aurelian eventually marched east and brought Palmyra back under Roman authority, ending her independent rule. Her city's brief moment of defiance left ruins that travelers still wander through today, largely unchanged by the centuries since. Petra thrived on incense and spice trade branching off the Silk Road. Carved from rose-colored sandstone cliffs, the city's temples and tombs rose where Nabatean traders funneled frankincense and myrrh from Arabia toward Mediterranean ports. Camel trains climbed narrow gorges to reach its hidden square. Water channels cut into rock, keeping the desert city alive through dry seasons. Petra's wealth came from controlling a narrow passage merchants could not easily avoid. Its carved facades still stand largely intact, weathered but recognizable after 2,000 years. Dura, Europos, served as a fortified crossroads between Parthian and Roman spheres. Perched above the Euphrates on a limestone bluff, the walled town changed hands between empires more than once, its temples reflecting Greek, Parthian, and Roman styles side by side. Soldiers garrisoned its towers, while merchants moved through its gates, trading goods bound in both directions. Archaeologists later uncovered a synagogue and a Christian house of worship preserved beneath collapsed defensive earthworks. The town's ruins offer a rare glimpse of frontier life, where cultures overlapped daily. The Euphrates River guided caravan routes toward the Mediterranean coast. Merchants followed its banks westward from Mesopotamia, using the water for drinking, washing, and occasional short passage by raft or barge. Towns and forts grew at regular intervals along its course, offering shelter and fresh supplies to travelers crossing otherwise dry country. The river bent northwest before caravans finally struck out overland toward Syria's inland cities. Its slow current shaped centuries of trade by pointing travelers toward the west. Antioch became the great gateway where Eastern goods entered the Roman Mediterranean world. Founded by one of Alexander's successors, the city sat where the Orontes River met routes arriving from Syria and Mesopotamia. Warehouses along its streets received silk, spices, and gemstones before merchants repacked them for the final leg toward Roman ports. Colonnaded streets, said to be among the first paved and lit in the ancient world, ran through its center. Antioch's markets carried the scent of foreign goods long before those goods reached Roman tables. Few cities matched Antioch in size, its population ranking among the largest in the Roman Empire. Estimates suggest several 100,000 people crowded within and beyond its walls, rivaling Alexandria and Rome itself. Bathhouses, theaters, and a hippodrome served residents alongside markets thick with foreign traders. The city's mixed population included Greeks, Syrians, Jews, and merchants from farther east who settled permanently near the docks and warehouses. Antioch's streets carried the noise of many languages, a fitting sound for a city built on the movement of distant goods. Goods reaching Antioch were reloaded onto ships bound for Rome. Dockworkers at the nearby port of Seleucia Pieria packed silk bales and spice jars into the holds of merchant vessels built to withstand open water. Captains waited for favorable winds before setting sail westward across the Mediterranean, a crossing that could take weeks depending on weather. Cargo manifests recorded on wax tablets tracked what left the harbor and what taxes were owed. What had traveled overland for months now continued its journey by sea. Let your breath find its own slow measure now. The inhale unhurried, the exhale allowed to stretch a little longer than before. Notice how each breath arrives without asking, without effort, the way tide arrives on a shore that has waited all day. Let the next exhale fall even further, carrying a little more weight out of the shoulders, the jaw, the space behind the eyes. There is only this rhythm now, one breath following another, asking nothing more of you than to keep breathing into rest. The Levantine coast hosted Phoenician, descended ports still active in Roman trade. Cities such as Sidon and Byblos, older than Rome itself, continued receiving ships loaded with glassware, cedar, and dye, centuries after their founders had faded from memory. Harbors, built by earlier generations, still sheltered vessels arriving from Egypt, Cyprus, and the Aegean. Local artisans kept traditions of glassblowing and metalwork passed down through generations of craftsmen. The coastline's long memory of trade outlasted the empires that came and went above it. Tyre remained famous for its purple dye trade connected to Mediterranean commerce. Extracted from the crushed shells of murex sea snails, the dye required thousands of shells to color a single garment, making Tyrian purple a mark of wealth and rank across the Roman world. Dye works along the shore filled the air with a smell locals had long grown used to. Senators and emperors alike sought cloth dyed in this exact shade, a color so costly it became reserved for the highest ranks of Roman society. Shell mounds from centuries of production still line parts of the coast today. Roman merchants in Alexandria linked Silk Road goods to the Indian Ocean spice trade. The city's harbor received ships arriving from India by way of the Red Sea, carrying pepper, cinnamon, and gemstones alongside goods that had crossed all of Asia by caravan. Alexandria's warehouses mixed Eastern luxuries with grain from the Nile Valley bound for Rome. Its famous lighthouse guided vessels into a harbor busy with languages and cargoes from 3 continents. Few cities in the ancient world gathered so many distant trade routes into one crowded, fragrant port. A separate path skirted Alexandria altogether, running down through Egypt to the shores of the Red Sea. Merchants favored this southern crossing when Parthian tolls or unrest along the Euphrates made the overland route too costly. Camel trains carried goods across the eastern desert from the Nile to waiting harbors. This maritime detour connected Roman buyers to Indian and Arabian ports without ever touching Persian territory. The sea, in this stretch, did the work land routes could not. An anonymous Greek merchant's handbook, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, recorded winds that carried ships from Egypt to India and back. Roman captains learned to time their voyages to the seasonal monsoon, riding it outward in summer and home again by winter. This knowledge turned what had been a slow coastal crawl into direct, open-water crossings. Sailors who once hugged the shoreline for safety now trusted the wind itself to guide them across open sea. Trade that once took years could be completed within a single sailing season. Berenice, a small harbor on Egypt's Red Sea coast, received ships arriving from India laden with pepper, pearls, and cloth from lands further east still. Warehouses along its shore stored goods before they began the desert crossing toward the Nile. Wells and way stations supported the caravans that linked this remote port to the rest of Egypt. Pottery fragments and inscriptions found there record merchants from as far as southern India passing through its gates. A harbor few Romans in the capital ever saw carried goods that would eventually reach their own dinner tables. From Berenice, laden camels carried goods westward across roughly 100 miles of open desert to reach the Nile. Way stations placed along this stretch offered water and shelter to travelers exposed to the heat of the day and the chill of the desert night. Once goods reached the river, they were loaded onto barges bound downstream toward Alexandria. This overland leg, though short compared to the vast distances already crossed from Asia, remained one of the hardest stretches of the entire journey. Sand and heat tested cargo and carrier alike before the river offered relief. Alexandria's markets gathered goods from every direction the ancient world could offer. Stalls near the harbor sold Chinese silk beside Arabian frankincense, Indian pepper beside Egyptian linen, all within sight of the great lighthouse. Merchants from Syria, Nubia, and Greece haggled in languages that mixed and overlapped along the crowded quaysides. Grain from the Nile Valley moved through the same port, bound for the bakeries of Rome. No single city better captured how far the Silk Road's reach had spread by the time goods touched the Mediterranean. Beyond Alexandria, the Mediterranean itself became the last great corridor carrying goods toward the capital of the empire. Ships that had already crossed deserts and mountains now faced open water, threading between islands and along familiar coastlines. Winds and currents dictated the pace of this final stretch as surely as they had on the Indian Ocean crossing. Sailors who knew these waters intimately guided cargo past Crete, past Sicily, toward the western shores of Italy. After thousands of miles overland, the sea alone remained between these goods and Rome. Roman galleys built for cargo rather than speed carried silk, pepper, and gemstones across these final waters toward the port of Ostia. Wooden hulls, caulked and pitched, held jars of spice packed alongside bolts of cloth wrapped against salt air. Captains navigated by familiar headlands and stars, following routes sailed by generations before them. Losses to storm or wreck were accepted as an ordinary cost of the trade, the price of goods that had already crossed half the known world. Each safe arrival meant a fortune landing quietly on Roman docks. Let the weight of your body settle now, beginning at the feet, heavy against the sheets, unwilling to lift even if asked. Feel that heaviness rise slowly through the legs, through the hips, each part sinking a little deeper into the mattress beneath you. The chest follows, then the shoulders, then the arms, until even the fingers feel too heavy to curl. The head rests last, full and still, cradled by the pillow as though the pillow had been waiting all day just for this. Nothing in you needs to hold itself up anymore. Ostia sat at the mouth of the Tiber, the working harbor that fed Rome, everything the capital could not produce itself. Warehouses called Horia lined its docks, storing grain, oil, wine, and the finer luxuries arriving from the east. Cranes and pulleys, powered by men walking inside great wooden wheels, lifted cargo from ship to shore. Officials recorded incoming goods, taxing silk and spice before they ever reached the city streets. From this harbor, mule carts and river barges carried everything the 15 miles upstream to Rome itself. Silk arriving through this chain of ports and deserts became one of the costliest goods a Roman household could own. A single bolt might pass through the hands of dozens of merchants before reaching an Italian market, each one adding a margin to its price. Senators' wives wore garments cut from cloth that had crossed nearly the entire known world to reach their shoulders. Its price reflected not the silk alone, but every camel, ship, toll, and desert crossing that had carried it there. Few fabrics in the ancient world carried so much distance folded into their threads. Pliny the Elder, writing from Rome, complained openly about the gold and silver flowing eastward to pay for foreign luxuries. He viewed the trade as a drain on the empire's wealth, coin after coin, leaving Roman hands for goods that vanished as quickly as they arrived. His writings preserve one of the few contemporary Roman voices troubled by the scale of this exchange. To him, the empire seemed to be buying its comforts at the cost of its treasury. Pliny put a number to his worry, estimating that vast sums left the empire each year for goods from India, China, and Arabia. His figures, recorded in his Natural History, describe fortunes spent on pepper, silk, and incense brought from lands most Romans would never see. Historians still debate how precise his totals were, since ancient accounting rarely matched modern record-keeping. Even so, his estimate reflects how enormous the Eastern trade had grown in Roman eyes. Inside the Roman Senate, lawmakers debated sumptuary laws meant to curb excessive spending on silk and other imported extravagances. Such laws aimed to limit how much citizens could display in cloth, jewelry, or foreign luxury at public gatherings. Enforcement proved difficult, since demand for silk only continued to grow among wealthy households. The debates themselves, recorded in fragments, reveal how deeply anxiety over foreign luxury had settled into Roman public life. Conservative Roman moralists viewed silk garments with suspicion, calling them scandalously sheer and unfit for modest dress. Writers such as Seneca criticized the fabric for revealing rather than covering the body, associating it with moral looseness. Despite such disapproval, silk continued to appear on wealthy Romans at banquets and public appearances. The controversy around silk reveals as much about Roman anxieties over foreign influence as about the cloth itself. Romans called the distant land at the eastern end of this trade Syrica, a name drawn directly from their word for silk. The term reflected how thoroughly China had become associated with this single luxury in the Roman imagination. Geographers and writers used Syrica loosely, uncertain of its true extent or borders. To most Romans, the land itself remained a rumor stitched together from the cloth that arrived from it. For centuries, Roman writers believed silk grew on trees, its fine threads combed from leaves like wool from sheep. This misunderstanding persisted long after silk itself had become a familiar luxury across the empire. The true source, the silkworm, and its cocoon remained a closely guarded secret held within Chinese workshops. Distance and secrecy allowed the myth to survive, unquestioned, passed from one Roman generation to the next. The Roman historian Florus recorded, likely with some exaggeration, that envoys from a distant eastern people once reached Rome during the reign of Augustus. Some accounts describe them as seers, a term loosely applied to peoples from the Far East. Whether these envoys truly came from China itself remains uncertain, and the record offers little detail beyond brief mention. The story survives mostly as legend, a faint echo of contact between two worlds that rarely met directly. Archaeologists have uncovered fragments of Roman glassware at sites stretching as far east as China, evidence of goods traveling the full length of the trade network in reverse. Delicate glass vessels, prized for their clarity and color, moved eastward much as silk moved westward. Such finds confirm that exchange along these routes flowed in both directions, not merely from China outward. A shard of Roman glass, found far from any Roman road, speaks quietly of a journey no single record ever fully described. Somewhere beyond the window, a low sound rises and fades, a hum carried on the wind that never quite resolves into words. It swells for a moment, then drifts back into silence, the way distant traffic or a far-off train sometimes does at night. There is no need to identify it, no reason to follow where it comes from. Let it pass through the room and out again, leaving only stillness behind, the kind that settles into the corners and stays. Roman coins have turned up in archaeological digs across Central Asia, and even within China itself, carried there through centuries of layered trade. Some passed hand to hand as currency, others as curiosities kept for their strange faces and foreign script. Their presence so far from Rome offers physical proof of a connection that written records only partly capture. A single coin, buried for centuries in foreign soil, outlasted the empire that struck it. Lacquerware boxes and polished bronze mirrors traveled the same westward paths as silk, packed carefully in straw and cloth to survive the jolting of camel loads. Chinese lacquer, built up in dozens of thin layers over wood, resisted moisture and kept its shine across months of travel. Bronze mirrors, cast and polished to a mirror, bright finish, carried images of dragons and mountains into households far from China. Traders valued them as much for their craftsmanship as for their exotic origin. Cinnamon bark and dried peppercorns moved through the same tangled network of roads and rivers that carried silk toward Rome. Grown far to the south and east, these spices passed through many hands before reaching Mediterranean kitchens and apothecaries. Merchants packed them tightly in sacks and jars to preserve their scent across the long overland stretches. By the time they reached a Roman table, their price had multiplied many times over. Deep in the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, miners worked veins of lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone prized across the ancient world. From those remote mines, the stone traveled west through Persia and beyond, eventually reaching craftsmen near the Mediterranean. Egyptian and Mesopotamian artisans had used it for jewelry and inlay centuries before Rome existed. Its long journey from a single mountain range shows how far a single object could travel before finding its final owner. Between India and Central Asia, the Kushan Empire held a stretch of territory that linked two very different trading worlds. Its rulers controlled key mountain passes and river valleys, taxing caravans that passed beneath their fortresses. Without this middle section under stable rule, goods moving between India and the Mediterranean would have faced far greater difficulty. The empire's wealth and reach grew directly from its position astride these ancient roads. Coins struck under Kushan rule show an unusual blending of artistic styles, with Greek lettering circling images drawn from Persian and Indian traditions. Some depict rulers dressed in Central Asian coats holding scepters, styled after Hellenistic kings. Others carry Hindu or Buddhist deities alongside inscriptions written in Greek script. A single coin, small enough to fit in a palm, carried three distant cultures pressed together in bronze or gold. In the region once called Gandhara, sculptors began carving Buddhist figures with faces and draped robes borrowed from Greek artistic tradition. This style emerged only after generations of trade contact had brought Hellenistic craftsmen and their techniques into the region. Statues of the Buddha took on wavy hair and toga, like folds unlike earlier Indian depictions. The result was a visual language shaped by centuries of merchants, soldiers, and artisans crossing paths. The city of Peshawar grew into a bustling hub where roots from China, India, and Persia all came together. Caravans arriving from the mountain passes to the north met traders heading south into the Indian plains. Markets there carried goods from every direction, from Chinese silk to Indian cotton and Persian glassware. Its position at this crossing point made it one of the busiest cities along the entire Kushan stretch of the route. Buddhism traveled into Central Asia and eventually into China, largely carried by merchants rather than missionaries alone. Monks sometimes joined caravans for safety, teaching and copying texts during long stops at oasis towns. Traders themselves, moving between Buddhist communities along the route, helped spread ideas as naturally as they spread goods. Monasteries eventually rose near trading posts, offering shelter to travelers and a place for scripture to be copied and shared. Along many Silk Road oases, temples of different faiths often stood within sight of one another. A Buddhist shrine might share a market square with a Zoroastrian fire altar or a small Nestorian chapel. Travelers of different beliefs prayed under the same desert sky before continuing their journeys the next morning. This mixing was less a matter of doctrine than of necessity, since oasis towns depended on trade from every direction to survive. Let warmth begin somewhere small, perhaps in the palms of your hands, resting open and heavy at your sides. Feel it spread slowly up through the wrists, into the forearms, loosening whatever tightness has gathered there through the day. Let it move into the shoulders next, easing them down and away from the ears. From there, it drifts into the chest, the belly, the long muscles of the legs, until the whole body rests inside the same steady warmth, heavy and unhurried, ready for sleep. Caravanserai stood roughly a day's journey apart, across much of the route, spaced so a loaded camel could reach shelter before nightfall. Thick mud-brick walls enclosed a central courtyard where animals rested and traders slept along the inner galleries. Fires were kept low against the desert cold, and watchmen took turns at the gate. This spacing shaped the rhythm of travel itself, turning long crossings into a chain of familiar walkable stages. Bactrian camels carried most of the weight across the harsh plateaus of Central Asia. Their double humps, thick winter coats, and wide padded feet suited them to bitter nights and shifting sand alike. Merchants valued them for their endurance through freezing mountain passes, where thinner-coated animals would have faltered. A single Bactrian camel could carry several 100 pounds of goods for weeks with little water. Nearer the warm Mediterranean coast, dromedary camels took over the work. Their single humps and shorter coats suited them to the drier heat of Persia, Arabia, and the Levant far better than their northern cousins. Traders swapped animals at certain crossing points, exchanging cold-adapted beasts for those built for sun and open desert. The change marked quietly a shift in climate as much as geography. A single caravan could stretch into hundreds of animals and dozens of merchants traveling together for safety. Camels loaded with silk, jade, and spice moved in long lines behind hired guards on horseback. Such gatherings offered protection from bandits and shared knowledge of wells, weather, and distant markets. Smaller traders often joined larger caravans simply to share in this collective strength. Few merchants ever carried a single bale of silk, the whole distance from Tianjin to Rome. Goods passed instead through a long relay of hands, each trader covering one stretch before selling onward at the next oasis market. A Sogdian buyer in Samarkand rarely knew the weaver in Changan, nor the Roman senator who would eventually wear the cloth. The road worked less as one journey than as a chain of shorter, connected ones. Local rulers along the route rarely let caravans pass without payment. Kingdoms and city-states levied tolls at bridges, mountain passes, and city gates, turning trade itself into a steady source of revenue. Some oasis towns grew wealthy almost entirely from these fees, rather than from producing goods themselves. A caravan crossing several territories might pay tribute a dozen times before reaching its final market. A sheet of paper, thin and unremarkable to the eye, carried one of China's quietest revolutions westward. Chinese artisans had refined paper-making centuries before it reached other lands, using mulberry bark, hemp, and old rags pressed into sheets. Traders and travelers carried the finished paper, and eventually the knowledge of how to make it along the same routes that moved silk and spice. Where it settled, older writing materials slowly gave way. By the middle of the 8th century, paper-making knowledge had reached the Islamic world through contact along these same corridors. Historians often trace this to the year 751, after a battle near the Talas River brought Chinese papermakers into contact with Abbasid forces. Whatever the precise circumstances, workshops soon rose in cities, such as Samarkand and Baghdad. Paper spread from there into the wider Mediterranean world over the following centuries. Gunpowder technology moved along related trade networks centuries after paper had already made its journey west. Chinese formulas for the mixture spread first through military and diplomatic contact, then through merchants who carried both goods and know-how across the same corridors. By the time it reached Europe, its uses had shifted considerably from its earliest recorded purposes in China. The routes that once carried silk had, by then, carried far stranger cargo as well. The compass, along with other quiet Chinese inventions, drifted westward through the same long chain of contact. Sailors and traders who touched the edges of these networks carried back knowledge of magnetized needles long before anyone recorded exactly how the idea traveled. Printing techniques and certain mathematical ideas followed similar uncertain paths. No single traveler carried these things whole. They arrived instead in fragments, gathered slowly over generations. Somewhere a candle has burned down to its last inch, and the flame leans without hurry, like it too is ready to rest. Watch how the wax pools and settles, how the light narrows into a single warm point before it fades. Your breath can follow that same shrinking glow, each exhale a little smaller than the last. There is only this, a small flame, dimming, and the dark waiting kindly on the other side of it. Grapevines, once foreign to China, took root there through centuries of contact with lands far to the west. Central Asian kingdoms, such as Fergana, had cultivated wine grapes long before Chinese farmers adopted the practice. Han envoys returning from the west brought back vines along with tales of fermented drink unlike anything made from rice or millet. Wine slowly became part of elite Chinese life, poured at banquets where foreign customs mixed with old court ritual. Walnuts traveled a similar path, carried east from the mountain valleys of Central Asia into Chinese orchards. Farmers in the Han territories added them to fields already growing millet, wheat, and rice. Other crops followed the same westward. To eastward drift, seeds tucked into saddlebags alongside bolts of cloth. Chinese agriculture, over generations, absorbed these newcomers so completely that few who ate them thought to ask where the trees had first grown. Peaches and apricots made the opposite journey, moving from Chinese orchards toward Persia and the lands beyond. Traders carried both fresh fruit on short legs of the root, and, more reliably, the seeds themselves packed in cloth. Persian growers took to the peach so readily that Europeans later assumed the fruit had originated there, naming it for Persia in their own tongues. The truth of its origin traveled far more slowly than the fruit itself. No one riding a camel across the Taklamakan ever called the route they traveled the Silk Road. That name belongs to the 19th century, coined by the German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen in his studies of Chinese trade geography. He used the term to describe a network of ancient routes he was mapping from old records and travelers' accounts. The phrase caught on quickly among scholars and, in time, spread far beyond academic writing. Merchants of antiquity had no single word for the paths they followed between markets. A Sogdian trader might speak only of the road to Samarkand, a Chinese official only of the way west past Yumen Pass. Each stretch had its own local name, tied to the town it led toward, rather than to some grand continental idea. The notion of one continuous road connecting Tianjin to Rome belonged to later historians looking back, not to the people making the actual journey. What later maps show as a single line was, on the ground, a tangle of trails shifting with the seasons and the politics of the moment. Rivers moved, wells dried, and mountain passes closed with early snow, pushing caravans onto alternate paths. A route favored one century might be abandoned, the next in favor of a safer or shorter crossing. The Silk Road, in truth, was many roads, braided and rebraided across centuries. War and unrest could silence a stretch of the route for years, sometimes for a lifetime. A garrison lost, a kingdom collapsed, or a rebellion spreading through a province was enough to scatter merchants toward safer, longer detours. Goods still needed to move, but caravans learned to wait out unstable seasons in walled towns, watching for word that the roads ahead had quieted. Trade along the Silk Road rose and fell with the fortunes of the empires that bordered it. When the Han Dynasty finally gave way in the early 3rd century, the eastern end of the Silk Road lost much of the order that had protected it. Watchtowers went unmanned, garrison towns shrank, and the steady flow of silk caravans out of Chang'an slowed to a trickle. Rival warlords divided the old Han lands, and each guarded his own borders rather than the long road westward. For a time, the corridor that once carried silk toward Rome grew quiet with neglect rather than peace. Centuries later, the Tang dynasty rebuilt what had been lost and reached further still. Tang emperors reopened garrisons along the Hexi corridor, restored the watchtowers, and welcomed foreign envoys to Chang'an in numbers the Han court had never seen. Trade caravans returned to routes that had sat idle for generations, carrying silk, paper, and news of a capital growing wealthier by the year. The road from Chang'an toward the west, quiet for so long, filled again with the sound of camel bells. Under Tang rule, Chang'an grew wider and richer than the Han capital had ever been. Its avenues stretched broad enough for parades of foreign envoys, and its markets sold goods from Byzantium, India, and the Korean peninsula alongside local wares. Persian melodies drifted from winehouses near the Eastern Market, and Zoroastrian and Buddhist temples stood only streets apart. Chang'an in this era counted, by some estimates, close to 1 million residents within and beyond its walls. Let the jaw loosen now, just slightly, the way it does in the last moments before sleep. Feel the small muscles around the eyes give up their hold, the eyelids growing heavier than they have all day. Behind closed eyes, there is only a soft, dark, wide, and unmarked, asking nothing of you. Let your face rest there, unguarded, as the story waits at the edge of hearing. Sogdian and Persian families did not merely pass through Chang'an, many stayed for generations. Sogdian merchants ran caravanseras and warehouses within the city, their names recorded in Tang tax registers and burial inscriptions. Persian physicians offered remedies unfamiliar to local doctors, and Sogdian dancers performed at court banquets described by Tang poets. Entire foreign quarters formed near the Western Market, with their own shrines and burial customs preserved far from their homelands. In the mid-700s, a general named An Lushan led a rebellion that shook the Tang court to its foundations. Years of fighting pulled soldiers and resources away from the distant western garrisons that had guarded the trade routes. Central Asian territories, once loosely held by Tang authority, slipped from its grasp, one outpost after another. The road toward Kashgar and beyond grew far less certain for merchants who had come to rely on Tang protection. Farther west, a different upheaval reshaped the route entirely. Armies carrying the new faith of Islam swept across Persia and into Central Asia during the 7th and 8th centuries, toppling the Sassanid Empire and absorbing Sogdian states one by one. Old fire temples fell quiet as mosques rose in cities like Bukhara and Samarkand. Trade did not stop, but the merchants who carried it now answered to caliphs rather than Persian kings. By the 8th century, a newly built capital rose beside the Tigris River, planned as a perfect circle by its founders. Baghdad became the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate and, within decades, one of the wealthiest cities on earth. Merchants from India, China, and the Mediterranean converged on its markets, trading spices, paper, and manuscripts translated from Greek and Sanskrit. Baghdad's scholars and traders together made the city a new center of gravity for the old route once anchored at Chang'an. In the 13th century, a different kind of unity swept across the continent. Genghis Khan and his successors built an empire stretching from the Pacific coast to the edges of Europe, folding dozens of kingdoms and city-states under a single ruling house. Old borders that had once slowed caravans with tariffs and suspicion fell under one administration. For the first time in centuries, a merchant could, in principle, travel from China to the Black Sea without crossing a hostile frontier. Under Mongol rule, this stretch of relative order came to be called the Pax Mongolica by later historians. Mongol officials issued safe conduct passes and maintained relay stations where messengers and merchants could rest and change horses. Bandits who once preyed on caravans faced swift punishment under Mongol law, and reports of theft along the road grew rarer than they had been in generations. Goods, ideas, and travelers moved across Eurasia with a freedom the old fractured kingdoms had never allowed. A Venetian merchant named Marco Polo set out along these very roads in the 1270s, traveling with his father and uncle toward the court of the Mongol ruler Kublai Khan. His account, later dictated and written down, described walled cities, desert crossings, and the wealth of Kublai's summer palace. Historians still debate how much of his narrative reflects first-hand experience and how much borrows from other travelers' tales. Whatever its exact accuracy, his book introduced generations of Europeans to a world they had only imagined. The same roads and trading posts that carried silk and safe passage also carried something far less welcome. In the 1340s, a wave of plague swept out of Central Asia, following caravan routes and trading ports toward the Black Sea and into Europe. Genoese merchants fleeing a besieged port on the Crimean coast are often credited with carrying it further by ship. The connectivity that had made the Silk Road remarkable also gave the disease a path it might never have found alone. Maritime trade routes eventually began to outpace the desert roads that had carried silk for centuries. Arab, Indian, and later European sailors learned to ride the monsoon winds across open water, moving goods in single voyages that once took caravans months of overland relay. A single ship could hold what dozens of camels carried, and it faced no mountain passes, no border tolls, no warlords demanding tribute at every oasis. Harbors from Malacca to Hormuz grew busier while some inland caravan towns quietly emptied of merchants. Ottoman expansion across Anatolia and the Levant placed key overland choke points under a single, taxing authority. Caravans moving through Ottoman-held territory faced tariffs at nearly every major crossing, from mountain passes to city gates once open to travelers of any faith or origin. Merchants who once haggled directly with local rulers now paid fixed duties set by a distant court. The added cost made sea routes, however uncertain, increasingly attractive to traders weighing profit against risk. Let your breath find its own rhythm now, without any need to guide it. Notice the inhale arriving on its own, and the exhale growing a little longer each time it leaves you. There is no pace to keep, no count to reach, only the small rise and fall that your body has always known how to do. With each exhale, let your shoulders settle a little further into whatever is holding you. The night has room for this, and for nothing more than this. European kingdoms, watching this shift, began imagining a way around the middleman entirely. Every bolt of silk and sack of pepper that reached Lisbon or Venice had already passed through Arab, Persian, and Central Asian hands, each taking its share of the price. Portuguese and Spanish courts funded voyages meant to reach India and China by sea, cutting out the long chain of traders who stood between Europe and the source. The ambition was plain enough: fewer hands, fewer tolls, greater profit. Vasco da Gama's fleet rounded the southern tip of Africa and reached the Indian port of Calicut in the year 1498. His voyage proved that spices, silk, and gems could travel from Asia to Europe entirely by water, bypassing the caravan cities that had profited from the trade for over 1,000 years. The Portuguese crown moved quickly to build a network of fortified ports along this new route. What camels had carried across deserts, ships now carried across oceans. Rival Khanates, splintering from the old Mongol Empire, slowly dismantled the unified protection that caravans had relied upon. Without a single authority guaranteeing safe passage, the relay stations and patrolled roads of the Pax Mongolica fell into disrepair across long stretches of Central Asia. Local rulers reasserted their own tolls and rivalries, and the roads grew less predictable than they had been for a generation. Overland trade did not vanish, but it lost the steadiness that had once made it remarkable. Archaeologists keep turning up new pieces of this old network beneath the sands of Central Asia. Recent excavations have uncovered forgotten caravansera, coin hoards, and even entire buried settlements once thought lost to shifting dunes. Satellite imagery now helps researchers trace faint outlines of roads and irrigation channels invisible from the ground. Each new find adds a fragment to a picture that no single ancient record ever fully described. The United Nations Cultural Agency, UNESCO, has since named dozens of sites along these old routes as World Heritage locations. Cave temples, caravanserais, oasis cities, and mountain passes across China, Central Asia, and beyond now carry international recognition for their shared history. The designation groups sites separated by thousands of kilometers under a single historical thread, acknowledging a network no single nation ever fully controlled. Preservation efforts now protect crumbling walls that once simply weathered on their own. China's government has, in recent decades, launched an initiative called the Belt and Road, explicitly framing new railways, ports, and pipelines as a modern successor to the old network. Officials invoke the memory of Zhang Qian's westward mission and the caravans that once crossed the Hexi Corridor, drawing a direct line from ancient trade to present ambition. The language borrows heavily from the Silk Road's old reputation for connection and exchange. Whether the comparison holds up, the old road's name still carries weight. The exact paths ancient caravans followed across Central Asia remain disputed among archaeologists and historians alike. Shifting rivers, buried oases, and the sheer scale of the terrain mean that many stretches of the old network have never been mapped with certainty. Written accounts from Chinese, Persian, and Roman sources describe general directions, but rarely precise routes. What survives is less a single road than a scattering of clues, pieced together slowly across generations of careful digging. The Silk Road survives now mostly as an idea, a shorthand for centuries when goods, faiths, and stories moved across half the known world. Historians still use the term to describe not one road, but a whole braided reach of contact between East and West. Silk, glass, paper, and prayer all passed along it, carried by strangers, who rarely knew where their cargo would finally rest. The name outlived the roads themselves. Blood itself carries traces of these old roads. Genetic studies of populations scattered across Central Asia show centuries of intermarriage among travelers, settlers, and the families of oasis towns. Researchers have found shared ancestry stretching from the edges of China to the mountains of Persia, evidence of unions formed over generations of shared markets and shared wells. The mixing left no monument, only the quiet inheritance carried forward in ordinary families. A single caravan setting out from Chang'an might not reach Rome for well over a year, passing through deserts, mountain passes, river crossings, and a dozen changing hands along the way. No one merchant walked the whole distance. Goods moved instead in relays, city to city, oasis to oasis, until silk woven in a Chinese workshop finally draped a Roman shoulder half a world away. That same moon that lit those distant caravanserais still rises tonight over rivers that still run, over travelers long since turned to dust, and roads long since grown quiet with grass. The need for rest has not changed in all these centuries. Let the roads settle now, let the lamps along them burn low, and let sleep carry you gently, the way it carried every weary traveler who ever paused beside a fire far from home. Good night.